Hello and welcome to Chapter 4, Project Planning and Project Infrastructure. During this chapter, this will be a multi-part video going over the basic outcomes of project planning as it pertains to the project infrastructure. We've talked about qualifying the MOV, and now we're going to move into planning the plan. So you've heard me say this before, we need to spend a lot of time on the plan. The better our plan is, especially as it pertains to things like scope and who's responsible for what, covering all the who, what, where, when, how, and whys that could possibly derail the project, we're going to be in much better shape. So it's that idea of that whole 80-20 thing, right? So we're going to look at describing the planning phase of the project life cycle, project infrastructure, governance, roles of the project manager. We're going to look at those in detail. Internal, external resources, who's going to do the work? Are they within our organization? Are we going to outsource? Are we going to do something in between? Do we have expertise that need to work with people outside of our organization? What is the project environment? 3 general categories of contracts we'll look at. And I have a great resource to a PalmBook video for you on that to further that outcome, if you will. And then develop the project charter, understand its relationship with the project plan. So again, project planning, phase attempts to answer the following questions. Here they are, what work needs to be done, who will do the work, what resources are needed, are those going to be internal, external, when will they do the work, how long will it take, how much will it cost, why does the time, money, and resources invested support the project's MOV? So again, we're going to see the MOV be incorporated into what we're talking about. Now, before we go any further, let's look at the example of a project that was hugely challenged and the results of that. So let me just bring this in here. Notice here, this is the CEO for Boeing, okay, Muhlenberg, and he, of course, got released in January of this year, 2020. Why? Well, basically because of the 737 project. So when we talk about IT projects, we're not talking about this kind of exponential project. Imagine the project it takes, to build a jet. Okay. So notice this project has gotten so far in debt that Boeing's going to borrow $10 billion, according to Reuters, as the company's 737 MAX drama drags on. So I would suggest you spend some time, get familiar with this, and understand this project is exponentially harder than a lot of what we're talking about here. Imagine just the technology from an avionics standpoint that needs to go into custom building of software specific to this airplane, for example, okay, and the challenges that have come with this project. So this is a humongous project, but I think the results are clear. People get fired over projects. That's the truth of the matter. Those responsible. And at the end of the day, the CEO is responsible for everything that happens at a company, okay? So, all the way up from project managers, sometimes we have projects that go awry and we need to ask someone on the project team to leave the project so that we can get the project back on track. So projects, of course, have an infrastructure. Here's a nice diagram. Notice governance and resources creates the foundation, if you will, that builds upon the project objectives. And of course, all of this supports the MOV that we've talked about in the previous chapter. So the infrastructure, documented. You're going to hear this all the time. The infrastructure should be documented. Our governance principles, practices, resources, and charter all need to be documented. The reason being, this creates that black and white communication that everyone can look at to figure out who's responsible for what the timeline is, etc. And when we talk about governance, as we know, because of stock market crashes, decades ago, etc., Sarbanes-Oxley came to be. There needed to be more oversight for organizations that were managing, that employees were investing in the companies they worked for, and lost their life savings, they, lost retirements, etc. We need to make sure there was more governance. So when we talk about this, we want to make sure that governance structure that our organization has established and uses goes into each and every project, goes into project portfolio, goes into projects, okay? Now in this, we're going to really be focusing on the project charter. Serves as an agreement and as communication tool for all the project stakeholders. So governance. So when we talk about the project, we're going to have a governance committee. That could be just a standard governance committee for our organization, or it could be a project portfolio governance subset, or even a project governance. And these are, made up of the stakeholders and of decision makers outside of the project, because the challenge becomes people involved in the project. This becomes their life. This becomes their passion, hopefully, if they're on the project team. And especially for the project manager, it becomes their job. So consequently, there tends to be this idea of who is going to oversee to make sure that the project really is on track. Who's going to make the decisions outside of the project team that need to be made to keep the project on track? That could be in the case of, borrowing more money to continue a project. It could be that final decision to stop the project, okay? And we need to have people that aren't necessarily, I want to use this term loosely, vested in the project, if that makes sense. So these are people that aren't engaged in it on a daily basis, and their job is to govern. It's pretty simple. Okay, so when we talk about project governance, I would suggest, I've given you a link here out to this project governance model. I would suggest you pause and look through this. This is based on an ISO 26000 definition, International Standards Organization definition, okay, of organizational governance, okay? So in this case, we're focusing on project governance models and how that pertains. Now realize that governance model should be throughout the organization. So of course, provides a framework to ensure that a project aligns with the chosen business strategy. We've talked about this, that that investments in the project are going to produce positive returns for the organization based, again, on the long-term strategy of the organization, of their mission, of their values, of their goals, etc. Okay, and of course, when we talk about governance, that's sort of that audit. They're going to keep that project on track. That's part of their job. We can have auditing built into the project team, and should, okay? However, again, remember, all the project team, all of the people that we're outsourcing to, anyone working on it internally, maybe we're even hiring people inside the organization, specialists, if you will, in areas that the project needs, okay, whether it's technology, human resource assets, whatever the case may be. So suddenly my job, especially as a project manager, may be weighing on the project success. So suddenly I may put on some rose-colored glasses, add to some challenges that, if aren't addressed immediately, can create an issue, okay? And I've got some examples for that as we go along. So project governance must define the structure, okay? Again, later on, I've got a video here that will talk about contracts, but you can find great resources on YouTube detailing more things like what project governance is, okay? And I highly suggest you use things besides the textbook and my lectures, okay? I may not explain something the way you need to hear it to learn or understand. So I'm constantly going out to the web finding additional resources for things that I need to learn. So structure, we tend to structure based on some default structures, whether it's the PMBOK or Prince2 that we've talked about, methods, policies. When we start with a standard, it tends to give us a template that we can work our project into. Now again, realize this may be just a couple hours worth of work that we do on a real basic, easy project that we're putting together. But I think what you'll see, my students are leveraging a wonderful textbook. They have a case study in there. And I think what they're already seeing, having spoken to a few of them early in the term, is the complexity of what seems to be a very basic IT solution that needs to be built can expand outside of the business into people that are volunteering how they might leverage the system, etc. So what is it that our customer needs, and what is it that the system might be able to do? What are the wants versus the needs? We always want to meet those needs and really lightly look at the wants. Remember, we want to put a project together that is going to be viable, that's going to be valuable to the company as soon as possible. Then we might go back and expand on that and add more features and functionalities that provide more value. But we want to make sure that we're meeting those immediate needs, especially if those immediate needs are causing stress on the business, additional expenditures on the business, etc. Okay, so back to what we're talking about, authorization. Stakeholders are given a clear understanding of their authority. Governance, of course, the governance committee, what their authority is, because we don't necessarily want governance down in the trenches, if you will. Okay, but we want to have that outside resource to bring challenges to that'll make decisions. So a lot of times, remember, in the governance structure, stakeholders are in governance, and then we implement stakeholders because stakeholders also tend to be knowledge experts in the area of the project that we're doing. You know, so if we're doing a project for marketing, we better have the marketing folks. They know what's unique to their business. They know how they're marketing. They know the strategies of their department and how to implement those into the project that we are doing. Okay, oversight and accountability. So, know their own role, responsibilities, as well as everyone else's. Then people can be held accountable. Again, if we don't give people a clear understanding of what their job is, what their role is, what their responsibility is, we then can't hold them accountable. I just recently I'll give you another example. We see so many security breaches that result from a simple phishing email, and we suddenly want to hold this employee responsible, but we never trained them on how to notify phishing, how to identify phishing scams, what to look for, what our policies and procedures in place are to limit the effects of a phishing scam. Okay? And if we're not training, we can't hold that person responsible. It's the same thing here. We need to have these job descriptions, if you will, within a project. People need to know what they're responsible for, when and how they're to deliver what they're responsible for, what decisions they can make, what decisions need to be brought to the project manager, what decisions the project manager needs to bring to the audit committee for the project or the governance committee even higher up. Okay, so again, decision making, kind of just talked about that. Resources, that the project has adequate resources, time to do it, money, the right people at the right time, which ones are insourced, which ones are outsourced. Okay, so to kind of diagram this, we've got organizational governance that will oversee project governance, that will oversee the project. Okay, so again, project governance may be built into the project team, the project manager, but we want those independent eyes who can audit, because again, we tend to get engaged, if we're the project manager and anyone on the project team, so engaged on making something work that we need outside eyes to say, you know what, this isn't the time. We're not going to spend any more money. This is really not what we expected. Maybe we need to go back, look at our plan, and better define our plan. So this one time through the plan isn't going to work. As we'll see, we can change our plan throughout. There are certain things that we shouldn't change, our budget, our outcomes, etc. But we may need to better define the plan. And once we do that, we can have a good plan that we can then implement on future projects based on the success and or failure of the project we're doing. Okay, so if you notice, going upwards, strategic alignment, business value, this becomes the responsibility of the project governance or the organizational governance to make sure that strategies are implemented within the project, that the MOV supports our recent goals, whatever. Authorization, oversight, accountability goes down. So as you can see, ultimately who's accountable, but as we saw in the example I gave you, who is accountable at the organizational governance level for this project that is failing? Well, that would be the CEO of Boeing. And thus, the result was him being asked to get off the plane, if you will. That's enough for this section. We'll go over more in part 2. Take care.